Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the cool and interesting messages the guides gave me in a healing journey for one of my clients a while back had to do with a default emotional resting state that they said spanned multiple lifetimes. And so, as is often the case with shamanic work, there can be a lot of layers to the things we're trying to heal. Sometimes I get to work with someone when they're just right about ready to make a change, so I can do an extraction on cigarettes from their field, and suddenly they wake up the next day going like, wow, I just feel done with this. And other times there are a bunch of other layers that they're working through. And one of the things that was really neat about this woman who I happen to adore, just really, really neat lady, is that we worked together over the course of a number of years. So in the various things that she struggled with, I got to go through layer after layer of what was influencing that. So we did ancestral healing and past life healing and trauma relief and things like that. And there was this emotional experience that was quite counter to her lifestyle choices. She was somebody who did a lot of very skillful meditation and had just really healthy practices. So it would seem counterintuitive that these kind of big emotional states would throw her for a loop. And so on this particular day with this particular journey, the guide said, we've really cleared and healed all of this trauma and all of this history. However, the thing that she's up against is a default resting emotional state. So sometimes we talk about this in terms of a facial expression, where the way that your face happens to rest gives people a reaction or a story about who you are, and it doesn't necessarily match the inside. But it just may be a resting face example that comes to mind, where you're like, oh yeah, this is an expression that someone's face might default to when they're not actively responding or engaged to the things around them in the world. And for this, I think of an emotional state kind of like if you have an old mattress, maybe one that wasn't super good. Sometimes I find this when I travel to an Airbnb, I'm thinking to myself, oh, I wish they would replace the mattress. But if someone sleeps in the same spot over and over again, the mattress can get more compressed in that area, and so you end up with a low spot. So when you try to sleep somewhere else on the mattress that maybe doesn't trap you in a dip, it's very difficult because you're on a bit of a slant. You tend to kind of roll into that. And I think that's a really strong metaphor if you're someone who has a couple of default emotions that you tend to kind of settle into. So ideally, as humans, we have this absolutely magnificent range of emotions. And another analogy, you could think of all the keys on the piano, all these different notes that could be played, notes that can be played together that harmonize, notes that create dissonance, just this incredible spectrum of emotions, like notes on a piano that are all distinct, that have relation to each other, but are all within this range of experience that can be had with a piano. And as humans, we have the ability to feel an incredible range of emotions. But unfortunately, I think that most of us lose access to the full range of emotions and tend to have some default emotions. And one of the things that's kind of crazy and wonky about this on a biological level, as I understand it, is the body really defends stability. So when we feel a certain way, we release a lot of biochemistry related to it. So there's this emotion, and our body releases chemistry. And this is great if we happen to have nice, balanced chemistry with the right amounts of the things that we're ideally having in our body, the dopamine, the serotonin, the estrogen and testosterone, like all these things. When they're in the right balance, it's really great. But when the body kind of gets off, when someone's running anger or fear really, really regularly, or low level beating up on themselves, I'm not enough, I'm not enough. They're these kind of specific emotional states. And one of the challenges is, in addition to all the things we do for mindset, there's also this biological thing where the body is trying to keep things really stable, which usually works to our advantage. It usually helps us to sustain health and come back to it if something comes out of alignment. But if we get stuck in a place where our mood chemistry is off, and we do some things, we do some mindset things, we get some fresh air, we move our body, there's some great things that happen with that. But there's also temporarily a place where our body is going like, oh, I don't know what this territory is. So it'll even throw up on the screen of our mind thoughts that evoke the emotion that we're dealing with. And there's kind of a sneaky thing that we can do, which has to do with even hacking our own chemistry with our thoughts and our imagination. So a really common thing is, if you start to feel an emotion that is scary or overwhelming or too much, you might default into stirring up another emotion that's more comfortable for you, because we tend to not be even-handed in our appreciation for all those notes on the piano. We're like, I love this note's great, and I would love to hit it over and over and over again, and ooh, I really, really, really don't like that note. So we don't have this even relationship. I think that if you look at some of the Buddhist teachings, there's a lot of just allowing and not trying to pick your note as much emotionally. And to be honest, I've brushed up against some of the meditation teachings and such, but I'm by no means an expert. So I'm working much more with the layperson understanding of biology and the messages and the information from my guides. But one of the tricky things we can do is use our brains to release the chemistry that we like better or dislike less. So if you're feeling really vulnerable or sad, you might stir up your anger story, because in the short term, anger feels a lot better than fear or grief. The trouble is, though, that it like revs up a lot of things, and so it'll suppress the immune system. I have a certain correlation between times I've gotten just livid about something, really, really deeply angry, and ended up with a cold on the other side. It wasn't the end of the world, but I definitely notice, and even when I don't actually get sick, some of the times when I go into really heightened chemistry for some reason, there's kind of a backlash, there's kind of a detox. So the temporary, hitting of those buttons, but we're very nuanced in the orchestration of our emotions in this kind of default way. So I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that sometimes I'll catch myself in the shower imagining a scenario that would annoy me and how I would deal with it and ultimately triumph. And sometimes I'll remember somebody who stepped on my toes. We're not talking about like terrible, you did me an enormous amount of harm kind of things, but just, kind of annoying things that really are quite petty and oftentimes a while ago. But if I've had a really deep dream time and I'm trying to wake up and the coffee is not doing the job, I'll catch myself, running some light indignation as an internal hack. And it's not something that I decided to do, as far as a choice. It's just something that kind of happens. So I think whenever we're thinking about this resting mood state, we want to think about the body defaulting to a certain place. And that's where, judiciously, sometimes psychiatric medications can be really helpful for breaking a pattern. Or there are a lot of really great ways to deliberately, knowingly work with your biochemistry. I've been enjoying a very moderate version of the cold plunge. All my research indicates it doesn't have to be super cold even. And I really like the chemistry, and I really like the way it impacts my body. And on days when I'm kind of grumpy and don't want to move at all, I know that just 10 minutes of exercise has massive mood boosting effects. And so I will often kind of get to just a low level. It doesn't have to be super intense. A lot of times once I'm moving, I, exercise closer to my goal or go through, because that kicks off a lot of chemistry. But it's kind of cool that just a 10-minute gentle walk has such extensive effects on the brain. And this could be, gentle dancing around to music, or, there's just a variety of things. So when you're thinking about this, the biochemistry element, I think, is really important to have a strategy for the body defaulting to that, because even if you start to grow and heal and resolve trauma and have a healthier mindset and have healthier practices, there can be a part of you that, in trying to find its compass and rebalance, can kind of work to default back to that. Like, almost a part of you that's like, ooh, you've been exercising for a lot of days. If you keep going, we're going to lose our chemistry compass of low-level depressions. So how's about skipping a day? And it's a nuanced determination, because sometimes it just really is kinder to be more yen. The really rigid approach to self-care of the body, I find, and not so helpful. There's this really interesting tension between indulgence and over rigidity, and there's kind of this interesting middle ground that can shift and change from day to day. But going back to this client, and something that may apply to you either in this lifetime or across multiple lifetimes, is what I was shown is this particular client just had a lot of lifetimes where she was working with the same kind of note or couple of notes of emotional unhappiness. So there was fear and despair and depression, and it was a repeated emotional state. And a lot of times when I do past life healing, it has to do with something that was chronic, that was a not great experience or thought or mindset or experience that you had over and over and over again, day after day. And you just didn't complete the emotional cycle of moving on to something else for a lot of really, really valid and understandable reasons. But as a result, it was just, for her, the emotional yoga was about constantly rolling herself out of that low point on the mattress so that she could bring her range of emotions back online and break up the kind of default to this particular suite of emotions that were really uncomfortable. Now, if you happen to be someone who runs happiness and wonder and contentment and appreciation naturally, I feel like, that if it's something that just happened naturally rather than through diligent work, there's a certain amount of human lottery that you won. I feel like we value all these qualities of, intelligence and this and that and the other thing, but I feel like a natural disposition toward authentic contentment. This isn't, silver lining bad situations or ignoring something that needs a change or trying to use gratitude to offset something that authentically doesn't work for you. I think gratitude is a good practice used judiciously, but when it comes to curating our lives, I think there's a lot of different kinds of wisdom that weave together, and sometimes it just really is good to change your circumstances if they don't work for you. But in my experience, most of the population just has a more complicated emotional landscape. And for those of us in biologically female bodies, there's a lot of emotional rise and fall with the cycles that we go through as far as our self-esteem and our self-image. And, it's really interesting to me. I've gone in and out of online dating, and sometimes I just feel like it's not the best if my emotional resilience is a little compromised. And other times, it's been a genuinely good place to connect with some really wonderful people and have some really great experiences. But I noticed several times when I was on hiatus that I would come up with the thought, I think it's time to reactivate my dating ads. And I learned to look at the calendar, and darned if it wasn't when I was ovulating, which cracks me up because, I don't have the story that my biology is determining. And so I would say, I think I'll wait until I think it's a good idea when I'm not actually ovulating, when my biology isn't saying, I think you should really drop everything and seek out some sexual opportunities so you can make babies. These systems are really, really potent in the background. Incidentally, on this subject, we tend to have our favorite feelings. We have the ways that we most like to feel, and a lot of our choices in life have to do with favorite feelings. I really like the presence and the in the moment and the experience of being on land. So there's a lot of my discretionary money that goes to travel because of the way that it can make me feel that I really, really enjoy. There are other aspects of me that I think are being fed by that. But I can also say that my most ill-advised dating choices across the board, where as one of my teachers puts it, your hands have turned green from painting red flags green. It had to do with a favorite feeling. Like, this person either makes me, or I believe has the potential to make me feel one of my favorite things: the intimacy of soul connection, wanted, chosen, sexual arousal and excitement. Like, these are things that were really compelling to me. And I compromised character or sustainability, or there were some really big emotional price tags where I just chose to get in the middle of a dynamic. For some people, it might be a relationship to alcohol or drugs where there are a lot of effects that aren't so good, but gosh darn, they love the way the thing makes them feel. And so it's just a good thing to be aware of, because, a favorite feeling can go really cool places. Like, I like the feeling of creating. So I knit and I sew and I make jewelry and candles, and there's a joy in that. I have a lot of crystals because the vibrations feel so good to me, and all of that is wonderful. However, if you have things that are crashing other parts of your life, like if I were overspending on crystals and I couldn't pay my rent because of how attracted and drawn I was to a vibrational experience, that would be, a different kind of issue. So when it comes to the emotional states that aren't so fun that we find ourselves in, we want to look at it. Are we avoiding another emotional state? Is this kind of a default? Is there a biological habit? These are some great things to look at. And when we have a favorite emotional state, are we always striving in ways that are disruptive to our life because we're sort of a bottomless pit for that flavor? Because that's where a lot of addiction and those kind of things can show up. And sometimes it's this pendulation. And so the thing I want to invite for you, and what I want to suggest, is thinking about two different things. One of them is the notion of just restoring the full range of emotions. If you were a piano and 75% of the keys were disconnected and not working, and you had 25% and you were playing along on 25% of the emotional experiences and really only using 5 or 10 of the keys anyway, just momentarily, you might want to fix the piano and restore all the keys and go back to the full range of human experience. We can play in subtlety. So, not a lot of us want to go to like absolute abject rage, but it's really great to be able to acknowledge and hang with low-level anger and not have it derail your brain, and, just be able to feel into nuances and experiences. And if we're not stuck in that low spot on the bed or chasing a couple of favorite feeling emotions, we can notice how quickly our emotional landscape can move and change. One of my teachers says the duration on an emotion is about 20 minutes, and then something else is bound to come along. It doesn't mean it might not come back. If you're in deep grief, you might have deep grief and then feel something else and then feel another thing. But a lot of times we aren't present with it. So the memory of the emotional state or the story of the emotional state becomes as if it was a continuous thing rather than something that actually had a lot of variation, even if you are defaulting to a particular set of emotions. And then the other thing I think is a great thing to ask is, what emotions is my soul really interested in experiencing in the course of this incarnation? Like, what would I like to experience? And maybe it's something brand new that you just didn't have a lot of experience. I end up with a lot of clients who had a lot of past lives as part of religious organizations and taking vows of celibacy. And when I look at their soul contract, part of what they were so excited to experience was romantic love and partnership and being a parent and these kind of experiences where, they had to choose between a spiritual and a secular life, which we don't in the modern era. And they resonated more to spiritual life with its limitations, but it was just more rewarding to explore. And not always safer, but often a lot safer. And then there's this opportunity to kind of expand in this other direction. I think part of the reason we're seeing so many transgender people, not that they haven't always been there, but there's the opportunity to experience diversity. It's a lot safer in a lot of places on the planet to be in a female body. So I think souls that, routinely incarnated in one gender may have decided to diversify and may find that the result of this interesting experiment is that the gender that their soul has not embodied over many, many lifetimes feels unbearably weird and wrong. And hence, all of the complicated journeys related to finding oneself in that experience. But going back to the emotional thing, I think it's just really interesting to innovate in a contemporary way. And so you may want to do some journaling or take a vision quest walk or tune into this notion where you're just asking yourself the question, what experiences, if I were going to guess, if I were going to make up a story about what my soul thought it would be really interesting to take advantage of so many opportunities for experience and stimulation to get to explore. So again, for a client who's been in an ashram many, many, many lifetimes, who then becomes a parent, the love and rearing of a child may have been the thing their soul was so excited to get to experience. And it may feel ridiculously complicated because in other areas this individual may have a ton of soul mastery, and then suddenly they, are in the 101 course of, keeping a child alive through the developmental stages. And if someone's been part of a tradition that had a lot of spiritually bypassing emotions, kind of how real and intense it gets in the world right now may be really throwing them for a loop. It may be feeling very complicated, and they may want to engage in some pretty serious numbing behavior. We do a lot of numbing of our emotions. And so one of these things is to just imagine that you could feel into what your soul was interested in, and then think about weaving some of that into your life. It doesn't mean that you have to try for something all the time, but you may want to create experiences that evoke that if it's something that really feeds you. Another great exercise is to look at the emotions that are really rewarding, that really bring in well-being. I do a lot of cultivation of wonder at the size of the universe, wonder at the beauty of crystals. I got a box of unclean crystals in the dirt from Arkansas, and there were all these little itty bitty, so intricate little world crystals, and I have a little tray of them on my desk, and sometimes I'll just pick them up and just marvel at the exquisiteness of this perfectly formed thing that's less than half an inch, in size. It's something that evokes that. The beauty of nature is always really good for that. Beautiful sunsets, the light through trees, part of what I love about travel is getting to see all this beauty and feel all of this wonder. Gratitude's a good one, but I feel like gratitude can also invoke shame, like, oh, first world problems, which can be acutely emotionally painful. There high suicide rates in first world countries, and I think that tells a story that it's not enough just to have our material needs met. For sure, it is hard not to have material needs met, and I want that for everyone in the world. However, it is insufficient to thriving in the world. And so that's kind of the complexity, which is a lot of why I just play wonder rather than gratitude. It's just cleaner. There's less story around it in my experience. But if gratitude is your jam, that's awesome too. And then there's an invitation to start looking at subtlety of emotion. I play with a lot of words. I have this huge vocabulary, and there's a charm to finding the word that most exquisitely illuminates something, or even changes a pattern of talking about something in a way that invites the brain of the listener to kind of put fresh attention on it. So our brains have this power saver mode where they just want to go like, oh, I know that, I know that, I know that. And then you're not taking things in with beginner's mind and curiosity and making connections in your brain, because that takes a lot of calories, and humans back in the day didn't have secure access to food. So we default to power saver mode. We need to jostle our brains a little bit, and cool evocative language for me is a really good way to do that. And the invitation here related to emotions is evocative emotions, and playing in the subtle has a lot of beauty. So it doesn't have to be like go big or go home by any means. It can just be like, oh, I'm noticing a little ennui. Oh, I'm noticing, this particular flavor of compassion. Oh, I'm noticing I have a little bit of tension and anxiety. There's a writer who writes in the genre of romance, although her books have a lot more than that going on, Catherine Center, and I recently picked up a couple of her books, and what I love is the main character goes on this personal growth journey of cleaning up some really maladaptive patterns that are getting in the way of their full expression of happiness. And there's, a love story in the background, but the afterword by the author I found really interesting, and she was making a case for part of why we love romance stories is we know that we're destined for a happy ending. So there's a confidence that things will get better, even if they're really hard, even if there's, something that is emotionally very difficult or complicated. And so there's this hope for the future. And when we're under stress, our brains tend to be afraid and imagine that the future is going to be the same or worse. If you've ever thought about things and worried when you were tired, you tend to assume you'll have either the same resources or less resources to deal with a difficult thing. And I would argue that that's not necessarily logically sound. A lot of us are on a path where our finances improve over time. Not everyone. Certainly, I think investing in emotional and psychological and spiritual health and well-being absolutely tend to make future Katie more resilient. And that's always what I'm working for my clients, that they just have more resources and an ability to deal with anything that comes up in the future. And so our minds misrepresent. So she was making the case that unlike suspense novels where you're always afraid something's going to get worse, there even knowing that, it's probably going to be all right in the end, in the moment there's this, tension, which is okay. I'm not adverse to people getting whatever they enjoy feeling related to diverse media. There just might be an invitation to branch out for this full spectrum of emotions so that, you don't always watch the same kind of show or movie that evokes a lot of the same emotions, but it might be a favorite. You might genuinely enjoy it. That's great. I think there's a lot of opportunity to move our emotional matrix with the stories that we consume, and humans love stories. It's dynamic. I think it's good to have some mindfulness. I tend to like, sci-fi and fantasy and such, but I stopped watching all the things in the DC universe because much as I like the stories, there was always a trope of evil that was evenly matched to the good in the world, and it was a lot darker. It's just a lot darker version of the world where there's a lot more violence and struggle and fear and pain. And that wasn't a good match for a worldview to put into my mind. And for someone else, it might be great. So I'm not like saying like, you should watch this, but not that. But I do think it's neat to open up some more subtle things. Like I think I've never watched the British baking show, but I feel like that's something that's really cool, or the home improvement shows. Or I've mentioned I like the YouTube channel of travel vloggers who are, just going cool places and making videos about it and sharing their travel stories. And the cool thing about, such diverse access to so many different shows and books and everything else is that we really can, sort of stop and think about, like, what do I want to feel? What do I want to evoke for myself? And, just going a little bit off type, diversifying our experiences. And again, it doesn't mean that if you're an introvert, you suddenly like pretend to be an extrovert and run around and, completely overstimulate yourself. Less is more. It can just be a pinch of this and a pinch of that. And then some consideration of like, what was that for me? How did that feel? As humans, we end up with a lot of rumination, and I think rumination is connected to these kind of default emotional states that we get stuck in. And so another way to go about this is just to find ways of disrupting rumination. I've been having a lot of fun with cold plunging. Again, very, very moderate, but that is a very effective way of disrupting rumination. At the moment that I'm going into this like 55-degree water, there is no rumination about anything outside the present experience, which is kind of a cool thing. And exercise and movement, or just being out in nature. There was a book called The Joy of Movement. I don't recall the author, but it was really cool because, they talked about all the brain scans on meditation and what that does for you. And she was comparing the language and the stories of people who like to go, walk in the woods and be out in nature, and their description of the experience matching a lot of the description of the experience of people who meditate. And she was drawing a parallel because, of course, you can have somebody meditate with a bunch of electrodes hooked up to their brain to watch what's happening. But, if you're out walking in the middle of the forest, it's not particularly available at this time to, take brain scans. Perhaps there'll be this mobile version that we come up with. But she was speculating that we're meant to do mostly just being open and available and present to the world around us and have less time. Some rumination is really good. It's good to like look at what you want and what your results were, and oh well, I really stepped in it. That was not a graceful social interaction. What do I wish had said in that moment? A little bit of that is good. We don't want to get stuck there, but our brain generating new possibilities when something doesn't go well is kind of our human superpower when we can get our brains to do it. But that's part of what I find so cool about travel. I went up to the West Fjords of Iceland in a solo trip, and I was just driving around and present with the car, and you stay very present with the roads because they have this incredibly sharp drop off. It's like a perfectly smooth, well-maintained dirt or asphalt road, and it gets to the edge and there's no rumble strip and there's no like curb or guard railing, or even like raised embankment. It just drops straight down the cliff. And so you can bet I was very good about never, ever, ever checking a text message while winding on these roads with these, hundreds of feet drop-offs. But that experience of just being present to opportunity. Okay, when does my body need food? Do I want to move? Oh, here's something, oh, let me pull over here. I'm so moved by the beauty of this. Oh, I think I'd like to do this. This looks cool. That availability is something that I don't get as much of in my, sort of day-to-day life where I can do things on autopilot. You can look to the cognitive bias where if you go an unfamiliar route that is actually at the level of fact a shortcut, it takes less time. Your brain will think it took more time because it's working harder to understand. You don't know exactly where the stop signs are or the things that are happening. So your brain is turned on a lot more. So it subjectively feels like more time than going the same route that you always go. And we can pop our brains into this kind of mode, but we need to remember to do it. So I know there's a lot here. I tend to enjoy weaving things together and interconnecting different pieces of wisdom, the information from the guides, what I know about health and brain science, and my own experiences and my clients' experiences. So I think that's a lot of kind of what I get up to in this podcast is weaving things together, which means just take whatever you need or whatever has value for you. But there's just an invitation to start to restore those keys on the piano and bring yourself back into relationship with the full range of emotions. And again, it doesn't have to be really acute. Subtle is awesome, so we're not trying to max out really, really hard emotions. It's an invitation just to kind of bring the full spectrum back online. That's good for our biology. It's good for the diversity of our soul experience. And it's just really good to know how to cause our favorite emotions. Someone said that women date based on their favorite feeling. Does the partner cause the favorite feeling? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there's a lot of truth to people making a lot of choices for favorite feelings. And it's neither good or bad. A favorite feeling can be creativity. Like, I genuinely enjoy making these podcasts, which is part of why I'm spending a Sunday alone in a room, talking into a microphone. But that kind of awareness, so that we're not limiting ourselves and running on autopilot, because it does increase the aging process if we're sticking with just a few emotions. It's not good for our brains or our vitality or our health if we limit ourselves to a couple of emotional notes. Now, if your couple of emotional notes just are happiness and contentment, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but that's not usually the case of what happens for humans. And sometimes it may just take a lot of extra concentration and focus if you're someone who has had past life experiences of a repeated emotional state that's similar to the one that you default to. And what can be a little bit hard about past lives is there's just a deeper well of something that we're working with that isn't immediately apparent. So if you want some help with that, I do past life work. I know there are lots of other people who do as well, but it's just something to think about, that, it may take more effort to roll out of that low spot in the emotions that everything seems to settle into. But I feel like that kind of yoga of the spirit is really worthwhile and has a lot of really rich rewards. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.